No role plays, just real. Chris and Lorenzo share 4 decades of combined experience to help you become a more effective leader.
We've never really, as a workforce, spent a lot of time on making sure we're developing good leaders.
We'll be able to share stories, experience, mistakes, failures, successes.
This is Hacking Your Leadership.
Welcome to Hacking Your Leadership. I'm Chris.
And I'm Lorenzo.
And Lorenzo, on this episode, I want to talk about learning and development.
Some of my favorite topics.
Mine too. I've been in organizations over the years, both where I've worked for organizations and I've consulted for organizations that kind of run the gamut of what their learning and development platforms are, what their goals are, what they're meant to do, how they're orchestrated, whether they're internal in-house or third party. It's kind of all over the place, and that makes sense. It's a part of kind of the HR function of an organization that tends to not lie in the objective. So a lot of different leaders have different opinions on the importance of it, on the effectiveness of it, and I have definitely seen some offerings more effective than others, but it starts with what the goal of it is. There are organizations where the goal is truly to be able to teach somebody something, and if they don't know it, they won't be able to do their job well. In other organizations, it's more of a compliance piece, right? So, what are your thoughts about this? Do you see kind of shortcomings in a lot of the learning and development offerings from organizations?
Yeah, I think there's a lot are still kind of in this antiquated space of like you've got manuals, you've got videos. I don't know that I've heard much about like the old cheesy videos that they used to just put on the TV and leave you in a room full of new hires and then walk away for 3 hours and come back. I think that most organizations have evolved past that. Hopefully, right? But I do think, though, to your point, what is the intent of this training to say that you've done it, or is the intent of this training to truly validate learning and development and understanding and the ability to apply what they've learned to what they're doing? And I think that the organizations have to make that decision in deciding how they're going to provide their learning, along with who's going to validate and follow up with it. I think many times you kind of have a system where it's like, we're going to have highly engaged trainers. We're going to have people that are involved in teaching people this new thing and or welcoming people to the organization and teaching them how things are done here. And then we're going to move on to this assumption that when they get to their job, their leader will continue to have ongoing conversations, validation, things like that. And I think you see it in a lot of data that we've seen, where it's kind of like you get that like 9 month to 1 year high level of enjoyment in your job. And then it starts to kind of like plateau or fall off. And many times that's as a result of the lack of follow-up and engagement or validation or continuing learning that I think organizations have. And I think there's just still a lot of assumptions that are made that when we say this is important and that we say that we want to live this as a value of an organization, that once they have kind of pushed beyond the formal training elements, that there is a continuing level of follow-up. And I don't know that I see that in most cases, in most industries, in most companies.
I think we can kind of agree that there is no one-size-fits-all process for learning and development that falls solely in one thing. Like it can't all be taught one-to-one, person to person. It can't all be electronic. It can't all be anything. There has to be a mix of things. If for no other reason, then different people learn things differently. Different people retain things differently. There are things that I can read and retain just fine. There are other things where if I read it, I don't necessarily want to retain it. I think, I want to see that in action before that makes sense to me. And it can vary from one thing to the other. And my coworker might feel exactly the opposite way in terms of what lands with them. I'm thinking back to, probably, 15, 16 years ago now, I got a speeding ticket. And it was my first one in a long time. And so I took the traffic school and I did online traffic school. And I just kind of like skipped ahead to the test. And there was like 7 or 8 different quizzes. And I skipped ahead to them. And I answered them all correctly because they're like mostly common sense questions. And I was able to do the entire traffic school in about, 25 minutes. And that was great because I remember doing one when I was a teenager where I sat in a classroom for 8 hours and it was the worst experience ever. So to being able to do it in 25 minutes, that was fantastic. Well, skip ahead now to last year. I got my first moving violation in more than a decade. And I decided, let's do traffic school again online. I'll get this done in, half an hour and be done with it. And I skipped ahead to the test again. The questions had nothing to do with driving. They were about what was on the pages of the content. So it would be like, it would say like, in the example of Lorenzo driving on this road, what was the color of Lorenzo's car? And I was like, oh my gosh, like I have to actually go back and look at the actual content in order to do this. So it took considerably longer. And clearly the entire time I'm doing this, I'm thinking to myself, okay, the reason they did this is because everybody skips ahead to the test. So then I started thinking, well, if everybody skips ahead to the test, then what's the point of the traffic school if the questions are accurate? So if I've skipped ahead to the test and I've answered them all correctly, then doesn't that mean I've done traffic school? Is that the point? Or is the point for me to spend hours doing this as some sort of I better be careful how I drive because I don't want to have to do this again, right? So if the goal is around like, don't, stop me from doing something, then it's accomplishing that goal. If the goal is, do I retain the knowledge? Do I know how to drive? Well, that would have been accomplished just by giving me the test, and then I can go back and review the information if I don't pass the test, right? Mm-hmm. And so I think this learning and development in organizations falls in much the same way. The leaders of the organization don't first agree on what is the purpose of the training. Is it compliance? Is it so that you can say in a lawsuit, yes, every one of our employees has done this training on sexual harassment in the workplace for 2.5 hours, or that you check off these boxes? Or is it because you want them to retain it? And if you want them to retain it, is it so that they can execute it, so they can demonstrate their knowledge of it? It runs the gamut. And so leaders have to figure out what is the goal of their learning and development process as a whole, and then individually, what is the goal of each individual training? That has to be where it starts before you try to get anybody to do anything or learn anything.
And I also think this day and age, like the time dedicated to how the training is facilitated, and to your point earlier, just the way in which people learn differently. How do you engage people? How do you keep their attention? There is tons of data that speaks to just the amount of time you have to sit in a training, and then just watching the graph go down. As the longer you sit there, the less you retain.
Right.
And so like there's just a lot of information on that. So like hats off to the organizations who are really starting to understand that you need to provide content in different platforms. You need to communicate with different types of vehicles of communication. You have to engage with different styles of presentation. You have to provide not only the content in one way, but then maybe if you've done a video for training, like do you give them documents or files that go along with it that have a transcript, like things that are easy to go back and refer to, like just continuing to change how we provide content to people, I think is going to be like a game changer that for all organizations. And I think that as we socialize and publicize the companies that are figuring this out and are building these great cultures of learning and development, my hope is that continues to influence across all industries and all companies. But here's what we know. That's a cost. There's going to be a cost associated with creating content at that level, with that type of variety. But I think about that cost versus the cost of you losing people and having to give them the old training over and over again. I think it makes sense.
Yeah. So there's a lot of data out there that says that roughly somewhere between 2/3 and 3/4 of employees self-report that they don't have a mastery of the skills needed to do their jobs. And that goes up in a time when there's high turnover and kind of the aftermath of the Great Resignation. There are a lot of people who are newer in their jobs, and that number will probably go higher. In a time when people are resigning less and changing jobs less, that number will go a little bit lower. But it still never drops below about 2/3. It's always 2/3 of people say they don't have a mastery of the skills needed to do their jobs. Now, You could argue that maybe some skills don't require a mastery; they just require an ability to do. Mastery takes oftentimes hundreds of hours on top of just the kind of the basic knowledge. So there has to be a cost benefit analysis in terms of the time that is spent on specific skills. But the report of not having the skills necessary to do your job, that report, that kind of self-reporting of it has to be rooted in a frustration with the job. And so if a person is not dissatisfied with the level of training they're getting, then they're likely to not report that they don't have the skills needed to do their jobs. But if they constantly feel like they're being asked to do things and then that they don't have the skills to do them, that will lead to people saying they don't have a mastery of the skills needed to do their jobs. And what that typically is, that frustration will lead to people feeling like they don't have the support that they need. It will result in lower engagement, and it will result in lower productivity and lower performance results too. Like you just not being able to do your job as well means that the results are going to be less. And if you layer on top of that an accountability for that, if leaders are holding people accountable to specific results and those people are reporting that they are unable to do those things, they don't have the mastery of those skills, then that's going to come to a head at some point in time where either a person is just leaves or they're going to be invited to leave because the work still isn't getting done. Neither is a good experience for employees or leaders. And if the conversations aren't happening around why employees don't feel like they have those skills, then it has to start with those conversations. Whether or not that lies in learning and development. I know when people hear the words learning and development, they're thinking platforms, right? They think log into this and do this item. But learning and development is absolutely the responsibility of leaders talking with individual people in the moment. After a interaction with a client or a customer, call centers, people listening in, this call may be monitored, giving somebody a debrief after a call like that is part of learning and development. That's part of validating what was taught to you. So, if these things aren't happening and the employees are being held accountable, that's a serious failure of leadership. If it's important, then you need to put your money where your mouth is and back up that it's important by putting the time and resources into training.
Yeah, I think the other thing that I would call out as well is I think that you just said it at the end, training, right? I think there's training, and then there's like development, and then there's like professional and personal learning, right? So for me, when I think about that, I kind of start to bucket them into those spaces. Now, there's definitely overlap. There's definitely overlap in all three, but I think of training as these are the specific things. Maybe it's compliance. Maybe it's, specific behaviors that are expected. But like training is, what is the job that you have? What are we doing to make sure that you can do it effectively? And what are the things that you shouldn't do or that could potentially bring harm to the organization? So that's training. Then when it comes to development, now it's how do we take what you're doing and help you to become maybe much more effective or efficient at it? How do we expand your scope? How do we provide you with experiences that give you a perspective so that you're approaching your job in a little bit of a different way? You're truly feeling like you're getting an element of development, this is beyond just you need to do this as the job itself, but you're getting some opportunities to, again, expand your knowledge or expand your perspective and get some experience to go along with that. Then there's learning, professional and personal learning. That, I think, sometimes is where you hear people say things like, you need to own your own development. What they really mean is you have to have an intrinsic motivation around your own learning. And it's really hard to move people that are not intrinsically motivated to learn themselves into feeling like you can help them to learn at work. I'll just put that out there.
Right.
It's really difficult to move them to that bucket if they in fact have no interest in learning themselves. So professional and personal learning, I see those things working very closely together, because those people and leaders that I see that put effort into their own personal and professional learning typically are looking for more learning at work that coincides with their development and their training. And that's kind of when you get a good little mix there. Too many times I hear people that say, I'm not getting the training that I need, or I don't have the skills to do my job effectively. And when you start to peel back the layers of the onion, they are putting no time into themselves. They maybe they lack an element of some curiosity, or they have no interest in expanding their knowledge, and they feel that it's on the organization or their direct leader to have to fill that cup with them with the limited amount of time they have to do that. So that's just kind of my thoughts on it when you start to really think about how and where do you spend your time, and what are the places that your people may be in, or what do you have to do differently as a leader to make that happen?
Right. Well, and clarity is kindness here, right? So if I'm a leader and I'm holding somebody accountable for something, and let's say that it's a certain amount of sales per month, and that person is falling short. If I know why they're falling short and I can talk to them about it, then great. If I don't know, then it's tough to just say, hey, you're falling short, fix this. As a leader, you do need to have some of the responsibility of at least being able to provide the information to them. This is what we're seeing, so it's not a surprise to them. This is what we're seeing, and this is why we think it's happening. Do you have any insight about why it's happening? Do you think we're wrong? Do you think it's different than what we think here? Okay, no, you agree this is why it is. Okay, how can we help? What do you find is lacking in the ability to get it done? Because if everybody was lacking, if it was just across the board, then maybe the expectations are too high. But if a lot of people are kind of managing this, and then there's some that are not, then one of two things is happening. Either they don't have the actual skills necessary to do this, meaning no matter what is taught or trained or learned or developed, they just don't have it in them. It's just not something that is going to be part of their forte. Or two, they have no desire to do it. Meaning no matter what you say to them, no matter what you train or give them in terms of development or coaching or sending them in front of a computer and teaching them how to do something, or having them self-lead the training or the teaching, no matter what happens, if they're still not retaining it, then it could be a matter of they're just not bought in. They just don't have a desire to do it. Either they don't see the need, or it's not something that drives them and they're just trying to get away with the bare minimum. Either of those things is it means that change needs to happen. But because they are so different in terms of the cause, as a leader, you can't approach the situation the same regardless of which it is. Each of those two things has to be approached differently in terms of how much responsibility you take on versus how much responsibility is on the person themselves. And so, as a leader, you can't just be kind of hoping things work out. You really have to figure out what is the deficit is rooted in what. Is it because I'm not doing something as a leader or giving them what they need? Or is it because they just don't have it in them to get it done, either from an ability standpoint or from a heart standpoint?
Absolutely. And with that, it brings us to this episode's 1 Minute Hack. But first, a few words from our sponsors.
The 1 Minute Hack.
All right, for this episode's 1 Minute Hack, here's what I want you to do. I want you to get out your pen and paper, and the next time that you have any type of formal learning, development, training, any type of process that you are going to expect your people to do, there are two things that you need to write down when it comes to this particular element. One, why it's important to you and the organization, and two, what is the follow-up date for validation that the information has been retained and can be executed. And this is not taking a test or a quiz after the training is done or completed, or something that is done right away. This is follow-up that is done days or weeks or months afterward to determine whether or not it has been retained. Anybody can retain something for an hour or two while they're reading it. It's whether or not it's being put into practice, and that has to be validated at a later time. And so why is it important? It's important to say why it's important, because otherwise people will tell their own stories about why they're being asked to do it. So you need to be able to articulate that, both why it's important to you and your organization from a value standpoint. And then two, write down when it's going to be followed up with, and tell your people when it's going to be followed up on too. Because if they know it's going to be, they're more likely to put the time and effort into retaining it, because they understand that at some point in time, they're going to be asked about it.
That's a great 1 minute hack. And with that, it brings us to the end of this episode. This is Hacking Your Leadership. I'm Lorenzo.
And I'm Chris.
And we'll talk to you all next time.